Now I'm going to focus on how does history view presidents. We have to give it a few decades. You can't just make decisions right away because history will ultimately be the judge and history seals the fate of every president. Now, Nixon left with one of the lowest approval ratings, but it was because of Watergate. Now, was he a horrible president? Actually, he increased relations around the world. He had some talents and stuff, and he did some really good things. And so his administration is viewed with mixed eyes. And he's not a bad president. He had a lot of smarts. And when he left, now here's an issue. Gerald Ford came in there. Everybody made Gerald Ford out to be stupid, and they were so hard on him. And he had a tough time being in office, and he was very unlucky. So history's given him some points too. And when Jimmy Carter came in, he just wasn't good. And he was not effective for one thing, but he was way too off the spectrum. He did not want to use military when there were situations around the world, like when he says give Hamas a chance. No. Terrorists can't be dealt with or negotiated with, and he's taken too much of a soft stance. So during the Cold War, he wasn't good. And he was not good for his time. He should have been an EPA head. He was good with the renewable energy, but that's about it. And, as he was out of office, Reagan was a huge strategic advantage. And Reagan has gotten points in history. He's about 10 to 15th ranked, but he may go up or down depending on how time goes. So historians like Reagan, and he had realists in charge of his administration. And people may say communism collapsed under its own weight, but the Russians in Afghanistan bankrupted their country by not being able to stop this insurgency, and they poured away at it. We supplied a few Mujahideen freedom fighters, and we had our Vietnam, they had theirs. And that's what ultimately led to the collapse because they couldn't afford that military venture. And then when Reagan says, oh yeah, look at this missile defense, they said, okay, we give up, and they fell apart. So Reagan gets there, and his military handling good. Have you ever threatening to begin that night?
I'm not gonna go there. I'm just gonna let history decide because it's not my business right now to make judgments. We have to let history take its course. And now when we can, who are the worst presidents? Hey, Buchanan, oh my God, that guy supported the enemy. I mean, when the U.S. was during the about to get into the Civil War, the South seceded from the Union, and he was sympathetic to that. And he allowed it to happen. He was inept. He was not really a leader. And the worst thing about it was he had a lot of experience in politics. And yet he refused to take action. And Andrew Johnson also was very sympathetic to the segregationist, racist Confederacy. And he kind of had those attitudes too. And then also, Herbert Hoover ultimately had the epitome of a failure president. And this is a real clear definition of a failure. They have a policy, doesn't work. And they stick by that policy anyway. And they keep drilling it into the ground, doing it over and over. He had a huge misconception because he thought it's not the government's job to get involved in the economy. But the problem was the Depression was not going to clear itself up. And he said it was almost over, and it wasn't. It was just not going to stop. In fact, the world economy was down. And so Nazism took over during the Depression because it weakened the government and weakened the military. And so Adolf Hitler took control of the country and basically exploited the situation. Just like the Japanese leaders and military leaders during World War II basically exploited the same situation. And the Germans and the Japanese formed an allied leadership. And, it also led to Stalin taking over, too. They were all using this power vacuum during the Depression, the weakening of a lot of systems to basically take control of the world. And that's what led to Hitler trying to take over the oil from the Middle East and North Africa. So that's one thing you got to look in history. And also, like people like Lyndon Johnson. Now, a lot of people have given him criticism for Vietnam. But his domestic accomplishments with the civil rights really gave him more points. And so
You got to look at everybody in perspective, and history heals all wounds. And basically, you got to look at every president, what are mistakes and key things that they've offered for the country, and then that's where historians decide. And historians will look at basically every decision they've made, every person in their administration, everything that they had control over, how they handled it, and that's where they decide. Now, are they liberal? In a couple regards, they say pursue equal justice for all, which some people might interpret as civil rights. Crisis management, which is probably something a Republican president would be more able to handle if it requires military, compared to somebody like Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton, where they have this kind of stance where they want to pull out of Somalia and give the rest of the world the idea they shoot, we leave. On the other hand, there's also things like domestic handling, there's things like who's in charge, and how they are at handling their job in charge. And there's a lot of gray areas in the presidency. And there's so much partisanship, but history usually doesn't take that side. It basically looks at everything that's been done. And some people have lucky presidencies. Like Clinton really hit on a lucky time, but his economic management is the highlight of his administration, with the exception of the housing bubble crisis that led because of his trend in home ownership. And he also had the lowest moral authority of anybody in office, with the exception of Nixon. Actually, they were both very similar. They were both bad presidents, but they knew what they were doing. And so we don't know how history's going to view the next two presidents, because basically history's in the making all the time. And it all depends on a lot of situations. And I personally don't think Bush is going to be judged in the Iraq War. I think there's going to be bigger issues around, and sooner or later the answers are going to come out. And it's way too polarized right now. And history doesn't take polarization. History ultimately looks at the time period. But what you got to understand right now is, during the fall of the Roman Empire, you had a couple people who were not qualified to lead. Like you had a 6-year-old emperor that was sworn in that didn't have any qualifications, and then he had people telling him what to do who were very dangerous for the empire, that launched a lot of attacks, and a lot of the empires got basically immoral. They started engaging a lot of very inappropriate behavior, and they also had very wasteful expenditures. They also outsourced a lot of their land to the Nordic and Germanic tribes so they would fight with their military, which was cutting corners. And eventually they got strong enough to sack the empire. And as the Roman Empire started to fail, you ended up with more polarization. And a lot of these people assassinated leaders and assassinated enemies, and basically it just became a huge fight and a lot of polarization. And basically that was, a crisis. People get scared and they start not knowing what to believe, and they basically take one side or the other, and it starts to get into a cat and mouse game. So, a lot of the corrupt Roman emperors teach lessons from the past that we need to really pay attention to, because a lot of them were very wasteful in their spending, and they had a lot of unsustainable attitudes, and a lot of times they would make very big mistakes that would end up costing territory from the Roman Empire, and eventually it led to its collapse. So basically, it's important to look at some valuable lessons in history.